The sound of a baccarat crystal flute shattering against the marble floor silenced the entire room. 200 of New York's elite froze, their eyes darting between the weeping woman in the modest grey dress and the woman in the scarlet gown standing over her, laughing. Everyone thought they were watching the end of a marriage, the moment the mistress finally pushed the wife out of the picture for good. They thought they were witnessing a tragedy, but they were wrong. They were witnessing a trap snapping shut, because the man smiling arrogantly in the corner didn't realize that the mansion he was standing in, the wine he was drinking, and the legacy he thought he was stealing didn't belong to him at all. The tires of the black Range Rover crunched heavily over the fresh powder as Callie Vance turned onto the winding private drive of the Blackwood estate. It was Christmas Eve in Aspen, the kind of picture-perfect evening that graced the front of greeting cards. The pines were dusted with white, the air was crisp enough to burn the lungs, and ahead, glowing like a beacon of warmth and wealth against the twilight, stood the ancestral home of the Vance family. For 10 years, this drive had signaled comfort. It meant hot cider with her father-in-law Arthur, discussing literature by the fire. It meant the chaotic joy of the kitchen staff, preparing the feast. But tonight, the looming stone facade of the mansion felt like the walls of a prison. Callie gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned the color of the snow outside. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. At 34, she still had the soft features that Mark had once claimed to love, but her eyes were tired. Dark circles, poorly concealed by concealer, told the story of the last 6 months. Mark wasn't in the car with her. "I have business to attend to in the city," Mark had told her 2 days ago, avoiding her gaze as he packed a Louis Vuitton duffel bag. "I'll fly in on the private jet on Christmas Eve. You drive up early and help Mother with the preparations. Don't wait for me." Business. That was the word he used. But Callie knew business had a name. Her name was Tiffany LaRue. Tiffany was 23, an Instagram influencer with a penchant for designer bags and other women's husbands. She had been Mark's executive assistant for exactly 3 weeks before the late-night calls began. Callie hadn't wanted to believe it at first. Mark Vance was the heir to Vance Global, a logistics empire built on reputation and integrity. He had always been the golden boy, but golden boys tarnish, and Mark had rusted quickly. Callie parked the car near the garages, avoiding the main valet circle. She took a deep breath, smoothing down her vintage emerald velvet dress. It was elegant, understated, classic Callie. It was also 3 years old. Mark had cut her access to the joint accounts 4 months ago, citing cash flow issues with the company, though Callie noticed his credit card statements showed massive purchases at Cartier and resorts in the Maldives. She stepped out into the biting cold, grabbing her own bags. There were no valets waiting yet. She was early, just as Mark had ordered. "Callie!" The booming voice warmed her instantly. Standing on the massive oak porch was Arthur Vance, the patriarch. At 72, Arthur was a lion of a man, though recent years had seen him leaning more heavily on his cane. He had built the company from a single truck into a global powerhouse, and he suffered fools poorly. "Arthur," Callie smiled, the first genuine smile she'd felt in weeks. She hurried up the steps, and he pulled her into a bear hug that smelled of expensive tobacco and cedar. "Where is that husband of yours?" Arthur growled, looking over her shoulder at the empty driveway. "I thought he was driving you." He had some last-minute meetings, Arthur. "He's flying in later," Callie lied, protecting Mark out of habit. Arthur's eyes, sharp and steel grey, narrowed. He saw right through her. He always did. He noticed the lack of jewelry on her fingers. Mark had borrowed her diamond anniversary ring to get it cleaned, 2 months ago, and never returned it. He noticed the tension in her shoulders. Meetings, Arthur scoffed. On Christmas Eve. The boy has lost his way, Callie. I've been reviewing the quarterly reports. The Asian division is bleeding money and he's spending his time in... He stopped himself, patting her hand. Never mind. Come inside. It's freezing. Sylvia is in the solarium, terrorizing the florists. Inside, the manor was a masterpiece of holiday decor. 20-foot garlands wound up the grand staircase, and the smell of pine and cinnamon was intoxicating. But the warmth of the house couldn't melt the ice in Callie's stomach. She spent the next 3 hours doing exactly what Mark expected, serving. She reorganized the seating charts because Sylvia, her mother-in-law, was too overwhelmed. She directed the caterers. She fixed the centerpieces. She made herself useful, invisible, and essential. The role she had played in Mark's life for a decade. By 6 p.m., the guests began to arrive. Senators, tech moguls, and old money families from Connecticut and New York, who summered in the Hamptons and wintered in Aspen. The driveway filled with Bentleys and Rolls-Royces. Callie stood by the entrance, holding a tray of welcome drinks, because one of the servers had called in sick. It was humiliating, but she didn't complain. She was trying to keep the peace. She was trying to survive the night. Then, the heavy oak doors swung open. A gust of wind blew snow into the foyer, followed by loud, raucous laughter. Mark Vance strode in. He looked impeccable in a bespoke tuxedo, his hair gelled back, a glass of scotch already in his hand from the car ride. He looked like the owner of the world. But no one was looking at Mark. Hanging onto his arm, wearing a dress that was less of a garment and more of a suggestion, was Tiffany LaRue. The dress was red. Not a festive cranberry or a deep burgundy, but a screaming, fire-engine scarlet covered in sequins. It was backless, low-cut, and slashed up the thigh. It was a dress designed to scream, "Look at me!" The chatter in the foyer died instantly. The silence was deafening. Mark didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he didn't care. He spotted Callie standing near a pillar, holding the tray of champagne. A cruel smirk twisted his lips. "Ah, there you are," Mark said, his voice booming across the quiet hall. He walked over, dragging Tiffany with him. "Tiffany, darling, you remember Callie? She's holding the drinks. Grab me a glass, would you?" The drive from the airport was parched. Callie froze. The disrespect was so blatant, so visceral, it felt like a physical slap. Tiffany giggled, a high-pitched, grating sound. She looked Callie up and down, her eyes landing on the modest velvet dress. "Oh, hey, Callie," Tiffany said, snapping her gum. "Cute dress. Very vintage. My grandma has drapes just like that." Mark laughed. "Be nice, Tiff. Callie works hard." He turned to his wife, his eyes cold and dead. "Well, the champagne isn't going to pour itself, Callie." Callie's hand trembled, the crystal flutes on her tray clinking softly together. For a split second, she considered throwing the entire tray into Mark's smug face. But then she saw Arthur across the room. He was gripping his cane so hard his knuckles were white, his face a mask of thunderous fury. He started to move toward them, but Callie caught his eye and gave a nearly imperceptible shake of her head. Not yet, she thought. Not in front of the senators. Not in front of the investors. Callie Vance had dignity, even if her husband had none. She lowered the tray, allowing a passing waiter to take it from her. She straightened her spine, channeling every ounce of grace her late mother had taught her. "Welcome, Mark," she said, her voice steady and cool. "And Tiffany. I wasn't aware we had a +1 for the family dinner." Mark said it was fine, Tiffany chirped, linking her arm tighter through Mark's. She flashed a massive diamond ring on her right hand, a ring Callie recognized. It was a Vance family heirloom, a cocktail ring Mark had claimed was lost during a move 3 years ago. The sight of it on this woman's finger made bile rise in Callie's throat. "It is fine," Mark snapped, his jovial mask slipping. "I'm the CEO of this family, Callie. I decide who comes to Christmas." "Actually," a cool voice drifted from the staircase. Sylvia Vance descended, dripping in pearls. She was a woman who cared more about appearances than happiness, but even she knew a social disaster when she saw one. "The guest list was finalized weeks ago, Mark. However," Sylvia looked at Tiffany with the expression one might reserve for a wet dog on a Persian rug. "We can have the staff set an extra place, perhaps at the children's table." Tiffany's jaw dropped. "Nonsense," Mark barked. "She sits next to me at the head table. Move, Cousin Gerald." The cocktail hour was an exercise in torture. Mark paraded Tiffany around the room like a trophy, introducing her to business partners who looked visibly uncomfortable. "This is Tiffany," Mark told the chairman of the board. "She's got some incredible ideas for rebranding the company. Young blood, you know? We need to get rid of the old, dusty ways." Callie stood by the fireplace, sipping sparkling water, watching her life disintegrate. "He's a fool," a voice whispered beside her. It was Sarah, Arthur's longtime attorney and a close friend of Callie. "He's worse than a fool, Sarah," Callie whispered back. "He's dangerous. He's leveraging the company assets to fund her lifestyle. I saw the bank alerts before he changed the passwords." Sarah took a sip of her wine, her eyes sharp. "Just hold on, Callie. Arthur knows more than he lets on. Just get through dinner." But Tiffany wasn't done. She wasn't content with just being there. She needed to dominate. She needed to prove she was the new alpha female of the Vance pack. She spotted Callie talking to a group of investors' wives. These were women Callie had known for years, women who respected her charity work and her intelligence. Tiffany sauntered over, grabbing a canapé from a passing tray. "So," Tiffany announced loudly, interrupting a conversation about a charity gala. "Mark was telling me that this house is just so old. The plumbing is tragic, right?" The ladies stared at her in silence. "We're thinking of tearing it down," Tiffany continued, oblivious to the horror on the faces around her. "Building something modern. Glass. Steel. You know, like the Stark mansion in Iron Man? This place smells like old people." Callie stepped forward. "This house is a historical landmark, Tiffany. It's been in the Vance family for 4 generations. It's not going anywhere." Tiffany smirked, stepping into Callie's personal space. She leaned in, lowering her voice so only Callie and the immediate circle could hear. "Mark says out with the old, in with the new. In business, and in the bedroom." The cruelty was breathtaking. Callie felt the blood drain from her face. "Oops," Tiffany said loudly, feigning a stumble. She tipped her hand. The glass of heavy Cabernet Sauvignon she was holding tilted, and the dark red liquid cascaded down the front of Callie's vintage emerald dress. The red wine soaked into the velvet instantly, looking like a dark, jagged wound across her chest. "Oh my God!" Tiffany shrieked, her hand over her mouth in mock horror. "I am so clumsy. But honestly, Callie, that dress was hideously out of date anyway. I did you a favor." Mark was there in an instant, but instead of helping his wife, he turned to the room, laughing nervously. "Accidents happen. Just a little spill. Callie, go change. You look like a mess." He looked at her with pure disgust. "Go on. Get out of here. Don't come back down until you look presentable." Tears stung Callie's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She could hear the snickers of Tiffany's delight. She looked at Mark, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. "Yes, Mark," Callie said quietly. "I'll go." She turned and walked toward the grand staircase, the wet velvet clinging cold against her skin. She could feel the eyes of the room on her back. She felt small, defeated, and utterly alone. But as she reached the first landing, she looked up. Standing on the balcony above, looking down at the scene like a gargoyle on a cathedral, was Arthur Vance. He wasn't looking at Callie with pity. He was looking at Mark with the cold calculation of an executioner sharpening his axe. He gave Callie a single, slow nod. It wasn't a nod of dismissal, it was a signal. The game, Arthur's eyes seemed to say, is about to begin. 30 minutes later, Callie descended the stairs. The wine-stained velvet was gone. In its place, she wore a sharp, black, silk tuxedo suit she had bought for a board meeting Mark never let her attend. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon, and her lips were painted a deep crimson. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a widow in mourning, or perhaps an assassin. The dining room was a cavernous hall, illuminated by 3 massive chandeliers. The table, set for 20, was laden with silver, crystal, and winter roses. At the head sat Arthur, looking like a king on a crumbling throne. To his right sat Mark. To Mark's right, in the seat usually reserved for the guest of honor, was Tiffany. Callie took her seat at the far end of the table, opposite Arthur. The symbolism was clear. The 2 sane people bookending the madness in the middle. Dinner was an exercise in excruciating tension. The servers, men and women who had known Callie for years, moved silently, their faces tight with suppressed anger as they placed plates of roasted duck and truffle risotto in front of Tiffany, who was loudly complaining about the menu. "I'm actually vegan on Tuesdays," Tiffany announced, pushing the duck away. "Mark, baby, didn't you tell the chef? Duck is so heavy." Mark, his face flushed with too much wine, waved a hand dismissively. "My apologies, babe. Chef, get her a salad. Something green and fresh." The chef, a man trained in Paris, looked ready to commit murder with a carving knife, but he nodded stiffly and retreated. As the courses passed, the conversation became a monologue. Mark ignored the senators and the CEOs. He ignored his father. He spent the entire meal bragging to Tiffany about his business conquests. Conquests Callie knew were fabrications. "I just closed the deal with the Henderson Group in Tokyo," Mark boasted, his voice slurred. "Doubled our shipping capacity. I'm basically rewriting the logistics map of the Pacific." Callie caught Arthur's eye. They both knew the Henderson deal had fallen through last week because Mark had insulted Mr. Henderson's daughter at a golf tournament. The company stock had dipped 4% because of it. But tonight, in Mark's delusion, he was the king of the world. Then came the tradition, the Vance family Christmas gift exchange. Usually, this was a time of thoughtful, sentimental exchanges. Arthur would give rare books. Callie would give personalized artwork. "Me first," Tiffany squealed, clapping her hands. Mark stood up, grinning. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. The room went silent. A box that size usually meant a ring. Callie felt a dull ache in her chest, not of jealousy, but of sorrow for the marriage she had wasted 10 years on. Tiffany opened it and gasped. It wasn't a ring. It was a key, a heavy electronic key fob with the Porsche crest. "The Cayenne Turbo GT," Mark announced proudly. "Parked out back in the snow. Custom red leather interior, just for you." Tiffany shrieked, jumping up to kiss him sloppily. The guests looked at their plates. A $200,000 car for a mistress of 3 weeks, while the company was allegedly having cash flow issues. "And for my lovely wife," Mark said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He reached under his chair and pulled out a generic white shopping bag. He tossed it down the long table. It slid across the mahogany surface, and stopped in front of Callie. The disrespect of the toss made the senator's wife gasp audibly. Callie opened the bag slowly. Inside was a box of Slim Fast shakes and a gift certificate to a local gym called Tone Up. "I noticed you've been looking a little soft lately," Mark laughed, winking at his friends, who did not laugh back. "Figured you'd want to get back in shape for the new year." "New year? New you, right?" The cruelty was so specific, so petty, it sucked the air out of the room. "And I got you something too, Callie," Tiffany chimed in. She reached into her oversized Louis Vuitton tote and pulled out a neatly wrapped package. "Mark told me you love cooking so much." Callie unwrapped the paper. It was an apron. But not just any apron. It was a cheap, frilly thing with the words, "The Help," printed in bold, glittery letters across the chest. "Because you're so good at serving," Tiffany giggled. "You know, with the drinks earlier, I thought it suited you." Silence. Absolute, heavy silence. Callie looked at the apron. Then she looked at the gym membership. Then she looked up, her dark eyes locking onto Mark's. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply smiled, a cold, terrifying smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you, Mark." "Thank you, Tiffany," Callie said, her voice steady as a surgeon's hand. "These gifts are very revealing. They tell me exactly where I stand." "Glad you finally get it," Mark sneered, pouring himself another scotch. "Oh, I get it," Callie said softly. She placed her hands on the table. "I suppose it's time for my gift to you, Mark." "You didn't buy me anything," Mark scoffed. "I cut your credit cards." "I didn't need a credit card for this," Callie replied. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope bearing the seal of Goldman, Sachs & Co. and the logo of a private investigation firm, Blackstone Intelligence Group. She didn't hand it to him. She placed it next to her wine glass. "We can open this later," she said. "I wouldn't want to ruin your appetite." Mark frowned, a flicker of uneasiness crossing his face for the first time. He recognized the logo of the intelligence firm. It was the one his father used for corporate espionage protection. "What is that?" Mark demanded. "Dessert," Callie said coolly. The dinner plates were cleared, but the tension remained, hanging over the table like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. The guests were restless. Several had already checked their watches, likely texting their drivers to bring the cars around. No one wanted to be part of the implosion of the Vance family. Mark, sensing he was losing the room, decided to regain control the only way he knew how: brute force. He stood up, tapping his spoon against his glass. The crystal rang out sharply. "A toast!" Mark bellowed, swaying slightly. "To family, to the future, and to the restructuring of Vance Global." Arthur, who had barely spoken a word since the soup course, slowly turned his head to look at his son. "Restructuring?" Arthur asked, his voice low and gravelly. "I wasn't aware of any restructuring, Mark." "That's because you're retired, Dad," Mark said dismissively, waving his hand. "Or you should be. You're old, you're tired. The board knows it. The investors know it." Mark turned to face the room, his back to Callie. "The truth is," Mark announced, his voice booming, "Vance Global needs a leader with vision. A leader who isn't afraid to cut the dead weight. And speaking of dead weight," he turned around and pointed a finger directly at Callie. "I didn't want to do this on Christmas, Callie, but you forced my hand with your attitude tonight. The way you treated Tiffany, it's unforgivable." Callie raised an eyebrow. "I treated her." "You made her feel unwelcome," Mark shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "This is my house. This is my future wife, and I won't have you looking down your nose at us." He reached into his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a folded document. He walked down the length of the table and threw it onto Callie's plate. These are divorce papers, Mark said. Drafted by Sullivan and Cromwell this morning. I'm filing them the day after Christmas. Irreconcilable differences. The guests gasped. To serve divorce papers at Christmas dinner was a level of sociopathy that even the jaded elite of New York were not prepared for. And, Mark continued, a cruel grin spreading across his face, since this house is a company asset, and you are no longer an employee or a spouse of the CEO, you are trespassing. Tiffany giggled, covering her mouth. Bye-bye, Callie. Mark checked his Rolex. It's 8:30 p.m. I want you out by 9 p.m. Grab your things, whatever fits in your car. Leave the jewelry. Leave the clothes I bought you. Just get out. Callie looked at the papers. She didn't pick them up. She looked at Arthur. Arthur Vance slowly pushed his chair back. The sound of the wood scraping against the floor echoed like a gunshot. He stood up, leaning heavily on his cane. He looked older than he ever had, frail and tired. Mark, Arthur said softly, you are making a mistake. The only mistake I made was waiting this long to take what's mine, Mark snapped at his father. Sit down, old man. I run this show now. I have the power of attorney you signed 3 years ago when you had your heart surgery. I control the voting shares. I control the accounts. I control the house. Mark walked over to Tiffany and put his arm around her. We are the new face of Vance Global. Young, vibrant, beautiful. Callie is the past. You are the past, Dad. Mark looked at Callie, his eyes full of malice. Well, why are you still sitting there? 8:32, Callie. Clock is ticking. Don't make me call security to drag you out. Callie slowly stood up. The room held its breath. She picked up the envelope she had placed on the table. The one from the intelligence firm. She walked slowly toward Mark. She didn't look defeated. She looked tall. She looked formidable. You're right, Mark, Callie said, her voice ringing clear and strong in the silence. There is a lot of dead weight in this company, and there are going to be some big changes. She stopped 3 feet from him. But you're wrong about one thing, she said. And what's that? Mark sneered. You think you own this house, Callie said. You think you own the company because of a power of attorney document signed 3 years ago. I do, Mark said. It's ironclad. It was, Callie corrected, until it was revoked. Mark laughed. Revoked? By who? Him? He pointed at his father. He hasn't signed a legal document in months. He can barely hold a pen. No, Callie said. Not by him. She turned to the guests, addressing the room. You see, everyone assumes that Vance Global is owned by the Vance family, by Arthur, and then by Mark. But that's not strictly true. When Arthur founded the company 40 years ago, he didn't have the capital. He took a silent partner, an investor who put up 60% of the initial funding in exchange for a controlling interest in the holding company that owns the assets. Mark rolled his eyes. Yeah, ancient history. That investor died 10 years ago. Some recluse in Switzerland. He did die, Callie agreed. Mr. Elias Thorne, a brilliant man. He had no children, no family. But he had a goddaughter, a girl he mentored, a girl he left his entire estate to, including the 60% controlling stake in Vance Global. Mark's smile faltered. What are you talking about? Callie opened the envelope she was holding. She pulled out a thick document with a blue cover. She held it up. Elias Thorne was my uncle, Callie said. The silence in the room was absolute. I didn't marry you for your money, Mark, Callie said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I have more money in my personal trust than Vance Global has made in the last decade. I married you because I loved you, and I hid my ownership because I wanted you to build your own legacy. I wanted you to feel like a man." She took a step closer. "I own the holding company, Mark. I own the building we are standing in. I own the jet you flew in on. I own the chair you are sitting in. And most importantly," she tossed the document onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud next to the divorce papers. "I own the board of directors." Mark's face went pale. You're lying." "Check the signature on the deed," Arthur spoke up from the end of the table. His voice wasn't frail anymore. It was booming. He was smiling. "Who do you think pays the property taxes, you idiot boy? It's never been me. It's always been Callie." Callie turned to Tiffany, who looked like she was about to be sick. "Now," Callie said, checking her watch. "It's 8:35. I believe someone needs to leave. But it isn't me." The silence in the dining hall was no longer heavy. It was electric. The air crackled with the kind of tension that precedes a lightning strike. The guests, who moments ago were checking their watches, were now frozen in their seats, gripping their wine glasses. This was better than any opera, any Broadway play, or any scandal sheet they had ever read. This was the public execution of a tyrant. Mark Vance stared at the blue-covered document on the table as if it were a venomous snake. His face had drained of all color, leaving him a pasty, sweating mess. He looked at Callie, then at his father, then back at Callie. "You can't." "This is insane," Mark stammered, his voice cracking. "Elias Thorne, the old man in Zurich? You're telling me you've been sitting on a controlling interest for 10 years and never said a word?" "I didn't want to control you, Mark," Callie said, her voice eerily calm. "I wanted a partner. I wanted a husband. I let you play CEO. I let you take the credit for the successes. I signed the proxy forms every year, allowing Arthur, and then you, to vote my shares. I trusted you." She walked around the table, her heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood floor. She stopped behind Tiffany's chair. Tiffany flinched, shrinking away from Callie as if she expected to be struck. But Callie didn't touch her. She simply leaned down and whispered, loud enough for the room to hear. "But trust is a finite resource, Tiffany. Isn't it?" Callie straightened up and turned back to Mark. "You asked for a divorce, Mark. You wanted to split the assets. So I did what any responsible majority shareholder would do. I ordered a forensic audit of the company finances." Mark's eyes widened. You audited to the books?" "Not the books you show the IRS," Callie corrected. "The real books, the ones you keep on the encrypted server in the Cayman Islands, the ones you thought no one could access." Mark slammed his hand on the table. "That's illegal. That's corporate espionage." "It's not espionage when I own the server, you idiot," Callie snapped, her voice sharpening like a blade. "And what I found was fascinating." She signaled to the back of the room. The doors to the kitchen swung open, but it wasn't the dessert course arriving. It was a man in a sharp grey suit, holding a briefcase. "Everyone, meet Mr. Henderson," Callie announced. "Not the client from Tokyo that Mark lied about. This is Agent Henderson, formerly of the SEC, now the head of Blackstone's Financial Crimes Division." Mr. Henderson walked to the table and placed a stack of files next to the divorce papers. "Mark Vance," Henderson said, his voice dry and professional. "Over the last 18 months, you have diverted approximately $12 million of company funds into shell companies registered in your name. And Miss LaRue's name." Tiffany jumped up, knocking her chair over. "What? My name? I didn't sign anything." "Sit down, Tiffany," Mark roared at her. "Actually," Henderson interrupted, opening a file. "You did. You signed as the director of Lux Ventures LLC 3 weeks ago, the company that purchased a $200,000 Porsche Cayenne this morning using Vance Global Operational Funds." The room gasped. Embezzlement was one thing. Involving a mistress in federal wire fraud was another level of stupidity. "It's a lie," Mark shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Henderson. "Callie cooked the books. She's trying to frame me because she's jealous. She's a bitter, vindictive housewife." Callie laughed. It was a dark, rich sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "Jealous?" Callie asked, walking slowly toward him. "Mark, look at you. You're a drunk, you're a thief, you're a liar, and you're not even a good businessman. The Asian division isn't bleeding money because of the market. It's bleeding because you fired the regional managers and replaced them with your fraternity brothers who have no idea how to run a logistics chain." She picked up a wine glass, Mark's glass, and inspected it. "I'm not jealous, Mark. I'm embarrassed. I'm embarrassed that I spent 10 years trying to help you grow up. I'm embarrassed that I covered for your mistakes. I'm embarrassed that I let you think you were a king when you were just a jester in a suit I paid for." She poured the scotch onto the floor. "But I'm done being embarrassed. Now I'm just the plaintiff." Tiffany was hyperventilating. She looked at Mark, then at the door. "Mark, you said you had your own money. You said you were a billionaire." "I am," Mark lied, sweat dripping down his nose. "This is just a liquidity issue, a misunderstanding. Callie, baby, we can talk about this in private. Please." He reached out to grab Callie's hand. Callie recoiled as if he were radioactive. "Don't touch me," she hissed. "And don't call me baby. You lost that right when you brought her into my home. You lost that right when you insulted me in front of our friends. You lost that right when you stole from the legacy Arthur built." She turned to Arthur. The old man was watching his son with a mixture of heartbreak and resolve. "Arthur," Callie said softly, "I'm sorry it had to happen this way." Arthur nodded slowly. He looked at Mark. "You stole from the company, Mark. That's bad. But you humiliated your wife. That's unforgivable. You broke the code, son." "Dad, help me," Mark pleaded. "She's going to ruin me. Talk to her. You can fix this." Arthur picked up his napkin and dabbed his mouth. "I can't fix a broken man, Mark, and I won't fix a criminal." "Criminal?" Mark laughed hysterically. "This is a civil matter. It's a divorce dispute. No one is going to jail over a few accounting errors." Callie looked at Agent Henderson. Henderson checked his watch. "Actually," Callie said, "that brings us to the final part of the evening's entertainment." The distant sound of sirens began to bleed into the room, growing louder with every second. Blue and red lights began to flash against the snow-frosted windows, casting chaotic shadows across the dinner table. Mark froze. "What? Who called the police?" "I didn't call the police, Mark," Callie said calmly. "I called the FBI." The front doors of the mansion burst open with a resounding crash that shook the floorboards. Heavy boots thundered across the marble foyer. "Federal agents! Nobody move!" A team of 6 agents in windbreakers, emblazoned with FBI, stormed into the dining hall. They were led by a stern-faced woman with a badge on her belt. Mark stumbled back, knocking over his chair. No, you can't be here. I have rights. I want my lawyer." The lead agent marched straight up to him. "Mark Vance?" "This is a mistake," Mark shrieked. "My wife is crazy. She's making this up." "Mark Vance," the agent recited, ignoring his outburst. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." 2 agents grabbed Mark's arms. He struggled, thrashing like a trapped animal. "Get your hands off me. Do you know who I am? I am the CEO of Vance Global." "Not anymore," Callie said quietly from the side. As they slapped the handcuffs on Mark's wrists, the cold steel clicking shut with a finality that silenced the room. Mark looked at Callie. His arrogance was gone, replaced by pure terror. "Callie," he begged, tears streaming down his face. "Callie, please. Don't let them take me. I'm scared. I'm sorry. I'll sign whatever you want. I'll leave Tiffany. Just tell them it was a mistake." Callie looked at the man she had vowed to love, honor, and cherish. She felt a pang of sadness, but it was distant, like a memory of a pain she used to feel. "I can't help you, Mark," she said. "You made your choices. Tonight was just the bill coming due." "Tiffany!" Mark yelled as they dragged him toward the door. "Tiffany, call the lawyer. Call the firm." But Tiffany wasn't making any calls. She was trying to slide unnoticed under the table. "Ms. LaRue," the lead agent called out. Tiffany froze. She slowly stood up, her red sequin dress shimmering garishly under the chandelier lights. She looked like a child caught stealing candy, if the candy were worth millions of dollars. I didn't know," Tiffany sobbed, her mascara running down her cheeks. "I'm just an assistant. He told me to sign the papers. He said it was for tax purposes. I didn't know he was stealing." "You can explain that to the U.S. attorney," the agent said. "Ms. LaRue, you are being detained as a material witness and a potential co-conspirator. Please come with us." "No!" Tiffany screamed as an agent took her arm. "He bought me the car. I didn't ask for it. Callie, tell them I'm stupid. Tell them I didn't know." Callie looked at Tiffany. "You knew enough to mock me in my own home, Tiffany. You knew enough to try to take my husband. You wanted the lifestyle? Well, this is part of it. The Vance family plays for high stakes. If you can't handle the losses, you shouldn't have sat at the table." Tiffany was led away, wailing, her red dress trailing behind her like a bloodstain on the floor. Mark was dragged out behind her, still begging, still bargaining, until the heavy oak doors slammed shut, cutting off his voice. The room fell into a stunned silence. The only sound was the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Callie stood alone at the head of the table. She looked at the empty chairs where her husband and his mistress had sat. She took a deep breath, and for the first time all night her shoulders relaxed. She turned to the guests, the senators, the CEOs, the socialites. They were all looking at her with a mixture of fear and newfound respect. They realized they weren't looking at a scorned wife. They were looking at the true power behind the Vance throne. "I apologize for the interruption to your dinner," Callie said, her voice steady and gracious. "It seems we have had a change in management." She signaled the servers who were staring open-mouthed by the kitchen doors. "Please," Callie said to the staff, "bring out the dessert and open the 1995 vintage champagne, the good stuff. We have something to celebrate." "What are we celebrating, Callie?" asked the senator's wife, her voice trembling slightly. Callie picked up her glass of water, raising it in a toast. She looked at Arthur, who was smiling at her with pride. "We are celebrating the trimming of the fat," Callie said, "and the beginning of a new era for Vance Global." She looked directly into the camera of a guest who had been subtly filming the arrest on their phone. "Merry Christmas, everyone." 1 year later, the winter sun hung low over the Aspen Mountains, casting long, violet shadows across the pristine snow of the Blackwood estate. To an outsider, the scene looked almost identical to the year before. The towering pines dusted with white, the smoke curling lazily from the massive stone chimneys, and the winding driveway lined with twinkling lights. But to anyone who stepped inside the heavy oak doors, the difference was visceral. The house, once a mausoleum of tension and hushed whispers, was now alive. Callie Vance stood on the balcony of the master suite, a steaming mug of artisanal hot cocoa cradled in her hands. She took a slow sip, savoring the silence. Not the fearful silence of walking on eggshells, but the peaceful silence of absolute control. She turned back toward the room. It was unrecognizable from the space she had shared with Mark. During the last 12 months, she had purged every trace of him. The heavy, dark mahogany furniture he had insisted upon, furniture that made the room feel like a boardroom, was gone. In its place were soft cream linens, light oak accents, and floor-to-ceiling mirrors that reflected the mountains. The room finally breathed. "Madam?" Callie turned to see Sarah, the head housekeeper, standing in the doorway with a warm smile. A year ago, Sarah had looked perpetually exhausted, terrified of Mark's drunken outbursts or Tiffany's erratic demands. Today, she looked 10 years younger. "The catering team has arrived, Mrs. Vance," Sarah said, "and Mr. Arthur is in the library. He's trying to teach the new golden retriever puppy how to fetch. But I think the puppy is winning." Callie laughed, a genuine bell-like sound that felt foreign but wonderful in her throat. "Thank you, Sarah. I'll be down in a moment. Make sure the staff opens the 1995 vintage for themselves in the kitchen, too. Everyone celebrates tonight." "Thank you, madam." Sarah beamed and closed the door. Callie set her mug down and walked to the closet. Tonight wasn't just a Christmas party. It was a coronation. She ran her hand over the fabric of her outfit. Last year, she had worn a 3-year-old velvet dress that ended up stained with wine. Tonight, she chose a custom-tailored white tuxedo suit with diamond-encrusted lapels, designed by a friend she had made during her keynote speech at the Davos World Economic Forum. As she dressed, her mind drifted back. The peace she felt now had been hard-won. It had required a journey into the belly of the beast. Her mind flashed back to 3 days ago. 3 days earlier, Federal Correctional Institution, Otisville. The drive to the prison had been a study in contrasts. Callie sat in the back of her armored Maybach, working on a merger deal on her tablet, while the bleak, grey landscape of upstate New York rolled by. Otisville was known as a club fed for white-collar criminals, but as the heavy steel gates rolled open and the barbed wire came into view, the reality was anything but luxurious. The visiting room smelled of industrial bleach, stale coffee, and despair. Callie sat on a hard plastic chair, her hands folded neatly on the table, waiting. When the door on the far side buzzed open, Callie barely recognized the man who shuffled in. Mark Vance had always been a man who took pride in his appearance. Manicured nails, bespoke suits, hair gelled to perfection. The man sitting opposite her now was a ghost. His skin was sallow and grey, hanging loosely on his frame. He had lost at least 30 pounds. His hair was thinning rapidly, and the orange jumpsuit looked comically large on him. He sat down, avoiding her eyes. He didn't look like a CEO. He didn't look like a predator. He looked like a ruin. "Hello, Mark," Callie said, her voice steady. Mark flinched at the sound of her name. He slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed and watery. "You came," he rasped. His voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't used it in days. "I didn't think you would." "I had business to conclude," Callie said, sliding a thick manila envelope across the steel table. "The lawyers finalized the asset forfeiture. This is the last of it. Your signature is required to transfer your remaining non-voting shares to the Employee Pension Fund." Mark looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "The pension fund?" he asked, a bitter laugh bubbling up. "You're giving my legacy to the truck drivers and the warehouse workers." "I'm giving the equity back to the people who actually built the company," Callie corrected him coldly. It seemed fitting, considering you tried to loot their retirement accounts to buy Tiffany diamonds. At the mention of her name, Mark's face twisted in pain. He leaned forward, his hands shaking. "Have you seen her?" Mark whispered. "Tiffany." "I haven't," Callie replied, leaning back. "But my head of security keeps tabs on all loose ends." "She testified against me, Callie," Mark said, his voice cracking. Tears began to pool in his eyes. The second the handcuffs went on, she turned. She told the feds I forced her. She said I was abusive. She cut a deal for probation. She walked away, and I got 10 years. "She's a survivor, Mark." "Parasites usually are," Callie said, feeling no pity, only a distant curiosity. But she didn't walk away unscathed. "What do you mean?" "The influencer life is over for her," Callie explained, her tone conversational. "Her reputation is nuclear. No brand will touch her. The last report I saw stated she's living in a studio apartment in New Jersey, working double shifts as a hostess at a chain restaurant. She's being sued by 3 credit card companies, and she had to sell the jewelry you stole for her just to pay her legal fees. She's miserable, Mark, just like you." Mark stared at her, the reality of his total destruction sinking in. He looked around the sterile room, then back at his ex-wife, the woman he had underestimated, bullied, and betrayed. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the tears finally spilling over. "Callie, I'm so sorry. I was drunk on it. The power, the money. I thought I was untouchable. I miss the house. I miss the way you used to look at me." He reached a hand out toward the glass partition, as if trying to touch her. Is there any chance, in 8 years when I get out, could we?" Callie stood up. The movement was sharp and final. "Mark," she said, looking down at him, "the woman who loved you died the night you let your mistress pour wine on her dress. She doesn't exist anymore." She tapped the envelope. "Sign the papers. It's part of your plea deal. If you don't, the district attorney adds 3 years for obstruction." Mark sobbed, a broken, ugly sound, as he picked up the pen. Callie didn't watch him sign. She turned and walked toward the exit. "Callie!" he screamed after her, panic rising in his voice. "Don't leave me here. I'm all alone. I have no one." The heavy steel door slammed shut behind her, cutting off his wails. Callie walked out into the cold winter air, took a deep breath, and felt lighter than she had in years. The memory faded as the sound of a string quartet drifting up from the grand foyer pulled her back to the present. Callie adjusted her diamond cuffs and opened the bedroom door. She walked to the top of the grand staircase. Below, the scene was magnificent. The house was filled with 200 guests, but the energy was entirely different from the year before. Gone were the stuffy, judgmental socialites and the sycophantic yes men. The room was filled with innovators, partners, the loyal employees Callie had promoted, and the steadfast friends who had stood by her. Standing at the bottom of the stairs was Arthur Vance. He leaned on his cane, not for support, but as an accessory. He looked up, and his eyes widened. Callie began to descend. The chatter in the room didn't die down out of awkwardness this time. It quieted out of reverence. Heads turned. There was no red wine stain, no look of defeat. Callie moved with the grace of a predator who has claimed its territory. She reached the bottom step, and Arthur offered her his arm. "You know," Arthur whispered, his eyes twinkling, "I always wanted a daughter. I just never realized I had to wait for my son to lose his mind to truly find her." "I'm not going anywhere, Arthur." Callie squeezed his arm. She walked to the center of the room. A waiter, the same young man who had nervously taken the tray from her the year before, approached with a smile, holding a bottle of champagne. "Champagne, Mrs. Vance?" he asked. "Thank you, David," she said, taking a glass. She turned to face the room. She spotted Agent Henderson, now her chief of security, standing by the fireplace. He gave her a sharp, respectful nod. She saw the new board of directors looking at her with genuine respect. Callie raised her glass. The room went silent. 1 year ago, Callie began, her voice clear and resonant, carrying to the back of the hall without a microphone. I stood in this spot and watched my life fall apart. I was told I was old news. I was told I was dead weight. I was told to leave my own home. A ripple of knowing murmurs went through the crowd. But winter has a way of clearing out the dead wood, Callie continued, her eyes hard and bright as diamonds. It strips away the rot and reveals the stone beneath. We have spent the last year rebuilding Vance Global, not on the lies of the past, but on integrity, transparency, and strength. She looked at the camera of the event photographer, staring down the lens, as if speaking directly to Mark in his cell. To those who think kindness is weakness, Callie said, a cold smile playing on her lips. And to those who think loyalty is a suggestion, let this be a lesson. The Vance family protects its own. And when you come for the Queen— She paused, letting the tension hang in the air. You better make sure you don't miss. To Callie! Arthur shouted, raising his glass. To Callie! The room roared back in a deafening cheer. The music swelled, a triumphant waltz. Arthur bowed theatrically. May I have this dance, Madam Chairwoman? You may, Arthur, Callie laughed, as they spun onto the dance floor, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the people who respected her. Callie glanced out the window one last time. The snow was falling harder now, burying the driveway, burying the past, burying the memory of Mark and Tiffany under layers of pure, cold white. She was no longer just a wife. She was no longer a victim. She was Callie Vance, the owner of the estate, the CEO of the empire, and the undisputed Queen of Winter, and she had never been happier. And that, my friends, is the story of how Callie Vance turned the ultimate betrayal into the ultimate victory. Mark thought he could discard his wife like an old coat, but he forgot the most important rule of power. Never underestimate the person who knows where all the bodies are buried, or in this case, where the Secret Servers are hidden. Callie didn't just win the divorce, she won the war, proving that dignity and intelligence will always outlast arrogance and greed. Now, Mark is sitting in a cold cell, wondering where it all went wrong. Tiffany is serving pasta to pay off her lawsuits, and Callie is running the empire they tried to steal. It's a harsh lesson, but a necessary one. Be careful who you step on to get to the top, because they might just be the one holding the ladder. What did you think of Callie's revenge? Was sending Mark to prison for 10 years too harsh, or did he get exactly what he deserved? And do you feel any sympathy for Tiffany, or was her fate justice served? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of justice served ice cold, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.